I'm really excited to have Michael Housman here today. Michael, I first got to know Michael through Evolve On Demand, which was a company founded by two of my friends. Back in 2006 is when the company was founded. But that company was acquired by Cornerstone On Demand, and he, until very recently, was there as their head of data science, and now has started a new company called Rapport IQ, which is an extension of his work in the area of HR analytics. And so he's going to talk to us a bit about his journey, about HR analytics in general, and in particular, how the human-machine interface is evolving over time. So, we've had some peripheral discussions about how robots are changing the workplace, and we'll talk a little more about that later today. And we had just done an interview where I asked him the question whether or not this means everyone's going to be put out of work, or does it mean that everybody's going to have fantastic work because we won't have to do any of the drudgery. And I think that's part of what Michael's going to address today. So, Mike, welcome, Michael.
Great. Thanks, Greg. Thanks. Very excited to be here. Just a little bit about my background. So I'm trained as an economist. Got a PhD in econometrics from the Wharton School. I'll say that a little quietly now that I'm inside Haas. Exactly. And having worked at Evolve and now co-founded Rapport Boost, I noticed there were a lot of things in parallel. And if anything, we may have borrowed the same playbook from my experiences at Evolve, in that we believe data science and predictive analytics can really elevate various functions. HR was where we're focused at Evolve. At Rapport Boost, we're very focused on chat messaging and conversational commerce. But we also don't think that machine learning and data science applied in and of itself in a vacuum can really achieve much without involving humans and getting human beings in on the loop and leveraging the strengths of both man and machine. So I'll start talking a little bit at kind of a philosophical level about where are we headed? Are robots going to take over the earth? Are we all going to be out of jobs in a few years? But then we're going to talk about brass tacks. How can we leverage all the exciting advances of data science to do our jobs better and to enable our employees and our coworkers to be better at their jobs? So I'll start, maybe it's just because I see these articles all the time because of what I do, but there are more and more articles that are coming out, and I'm sure everyone's noticed, that suggest that robots, machines, are going to be taking over our work. And it's not just starting at call centers and bots automating kind of typical day-to-day work, but I'm seeing more and more articles that suggest it's lawyers and doctors and accountants and all sorts of what you would consider white-collar jobs to be potentially in jeopardy. And so this to me seems very alarmist. It feels like the conversation has been an either-or, right? It's either we're going to do these jobs, or tomorrow we're going to wake up and a robot's going to be sitting in our seat doing our job for us. And we're seeing evidence of that in a lot of different industries. I mentioned first healthcare. I have friends who have worked on the Da Vinci robot, and it's actually very, very good, better at humans, at doing very typical, non-complicated cases. So very similar surgeries. They can do that over and over again. Throughput's higher, quality's better. It's concerning, and obviously the goal is to expand from typical surgeries to things that are more and more complex. I don't think anytime soon they'll be doing open heart surgery, but that's kind of on they're in their sights. Was reading an article recently, cruise lines are starting to implement robot bartenders. I actually had a friend who built one, and it served me a pretty good gin and tonic, so I was really impressed. Like these things, it's not that hard, mixing fluids in different proportions, and you order a drink and it comes out in front of you. Self-driving cars, I think that's the most obvious example of where we're going to see some transformation in the next few years, right? We probably, all of you hopefully have seen some of them driving around. In San Francisco, you can't avoid them. You see the Uber cars, or we saw the Uber cars until they got shipped off to Arizona. If you're in Mountain View, you're going to see a Google car driving around, sometimes with a passenger on the side, sometimes not. And I personally think the canary in the coal mine for this jobs migration is going to be truck drivers. There are 1.8 million long-haul truck drivers in the U.S. Those jobs, especially on long open stretches of highway, I think those are going to be automated. They are being automated now, and I think we're going to see over the next 3 to 5 years that transformation occur, and you're going to end up with 1.8 million employees, former truck drivers, that are trying to figure out, well, what do I do with this skill set? And that is something that is on the forefront of my mind. And then recently, there are fast food chains that are now trying to automate burger flipping. It was a couple weeks ago, I went to a restaurant they prepare salads. There's one employee in the entire restaurant, and he just guides you to the front of the line. You select your order, you wait, and then out of what looks like a microwave cubby hole, your salad is prepared, and about 10 minutes later, you have a nice salad. Behind the scenes, I think there are human beings still that putting things in the bowl, but it was amazing to me that it worked incredibly fast, and the lines were very short, and I went there a couple times because I was really fascinated by this. So all this is to say, and I'm asking an open question. I have my own viewpoint, and I'll probably be beating you guys over the head with it for the next 90 minutes. But is this where we're heading? Are we headed to a place where robots are going to be taking over these jobs, starting with the burger flippers and the salad makers, and moving their way up to truck drivers, and eventually doctors, lawyers, business leaders? What do you guys think? Is this a legitimate concern? I don't think it's going to happen overnight. It's not happening tomorrow, but is this something that makes all of you nervous, excited? What are your thoughts?
I think it is nervous and exciting at the same time. It's definitely true that some of the jobs would be taken over by robots, but that's also true that when you look at the history, you look at these shifts. Like for example, long time back, right? Like more than 50% of the people used to work in agriculture. Right now, 2% people work in agriculture and produce more than what 50% of us used to do. So I feel that like this App Store is another example. App Store was not there 10 years before, and now these billions of dollars of sales happens through App Store. So I feel that there would be new jobs that would be created, but at the same time there would be real pain to some other people, like especially like the truck drivers, etc. Right? It would be really hard for some other people.
This is a huge discussion in France too, right?
Definitely, we have this kind of question also at the level of the government in order to have this kind of law. From my personal point of view, if it's a disruption that my lawyer is a robot, I think it will be a huge progress for the society.
Yeah.
So I would say I've been interviewing people for a new application, and they're so worried about that they're losing their jobs that, like, even though we know we are not there to completely replace their jobs, people are so fearful because of all these articles in the main media that I think that will slow it down because of just the amount of fear that all these doctors and nurses and lawyers have. Like they would not just let it come in so easily, would be my guess, just because of the fear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it also depends on the industry because I think three of us are working in the banking sector, and so we made the math. Before having robots, there's also automatization. And so out of the workforce that we have, 30 to 35% are doing reporting, just basic reporting from one system to another. And so this, definitely we can actually make it work automatically over the next 5 years. So there's definitely something at stake. Before, definitely not that robots, but the pace is accelerating, and definitely outside of like truck drivers, industries will change dramatically.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think we're seeing that transformation now. I think that people tend to be a little bit alarmist, and the concern is, well, the real question is exactly what you had posed, which is, are we going to kind of jump there very quickly, or are we going to see this gradual transformation? And can robots, as robots are taking over those roles, does that free up opportunities for the person who fixes the robots, right? I think the only distinction that I've heard that's really interesting with what we saw this actually occur many decades ago with the industrial transformation, right? The industrial revolution, that robots were taking over jobs in factories and agriculture that humans had previously done. The nice thing then was that there were other roles available to human beings in service industries, and that's kind of where we tended to migrate. However, now I think the concern is, oh God, now they're taking those service roles. Where do we go from here, right? We might have nowhere to escape. But I tend to think that people are very alarmist about this, and you see this very sensationalistic news about, oh God, the robots are taking over, and I can see some pushback now. I personally, however, and this is my hypothesis and the thesis that I'm going to beat you guys over the head with, I don't think it's an either and. I don't think that it's a what are humans suited to do and what are computers suited to do, and let's separate jobs out. I think that what we're going to see for the next 20, 30 years across most professions is that it's an and, right? That human and computer is better than either one alone. Chess is a great example because we know, oh, sorry, go ahead.
If robots are going to do the jobs.
Give me that again, sorry.
What is the need for humans to work in 20 years from now? Why do we need to work if they are doing the work? As long as there is food, there is shelter, we don't need to work.
Yeah, I mean, that's even farther out. There are some really interesting debates. I love talking about this, and I'll try to stay focused so we learn something. But there are debates about, well, maybe we don't have to work, right? The median estimate for singularity, this is the point where robots become smarter than humans, the median estimate is 40 years. It feels like a long time from now. That's not that long, and certainly not in the span of human existence. That's a blink. So 40 years from now, it could be more, it could be less, but at the point when robots become smarter than us at a variety of different aspects and just potentially in general, then there are these philosophical questions, and I won't dig into that now, about, well, what do we do, right? Once we've gotten to that point, do we need to work? Can we just focus on intellectual pursuits? Again, topic for another day, but I think it's fascinating. I love talking about this stuff. So I'm more focused on okay, well, before those 40 years are up, all of us kind of working right now, what are we likely to see, and how can we use machines and computers and data science to do our jobs better, right? We're not there yet. And I think chess is a great example where obviously it was a big moment when Garry Kasparov lost to Deep Blue. Chess machines, computers were better than humans at chess. But what beat both for about 15 years after that was a human with a calculator or a computer at his side, right? And actually this is a photo of computer chess. This is a way of playing chess between two human beings, but they each have a computer at their side, and they don't have to worry about kind of mundane tip calculations. They can be thinking about bigger strategy, right? So I've seen that philosophy, I've applied that philosophy to two areas, and I want to dig deep and really understand how it's transforming two industries. Greg had alluded to what we did in HR analytics, so I'm going to spend for at least half an hour. I want to dig in and understand a little bit more about people analytics and how we were doing this at Evolve, and offer up some very concrete examples, and then I'll talk about how we've applied that at Rapport Boost. So to set the stage, we'll talk broadly about the big data revolution. I'm assuming everyone here is probably familiar with Moneyball, right? Example is pretty simple. It's transformed baseball. That previously baseball scouts would sit in a room and they'd talk about whether a player had 5 tools, whether his girlfriend was attractive or not. That's what they were using to make decisions. It sounds funny, it's true, right? Coming in, Billy Beane and the Oakland A's said, we're going to do this in a lot more mathematical way. And ultimately, we're able to leverage a very small payroll to build a team that was very successful. And so I think other industries now, having recognized the successes of that approach, we're seeing it applied to other industries. Financial services, everyone's familiar with FICO scores. We forget very quickly, people don't realize that we go back a few decades, the way that banks made lending decisions were calling up another bank and saying, what do you think about Bob as a credit risk? What's he like? Does he have kids? Things like that. It sounds crazy, but this is not too far off from where we were a number of years ago. Now we've systematized it, right? We know all these financial data and transactions can be fed into a single database, and that FICO score can be optimized in real time, and that score is a better predictor of you as a credit risk than my opinion of you, even knowing you personally as a neighbor or a friend. Healthcare. I actually have a bit of a healthcare background. I studied to be an economist in a former life before I got more focused on organizational behavior and workforce analytics. In healthcare, the amount of variation in practice across physicians is staggering. So if you go into the hospital and you're about to deliver, the likelihood that you have a cesarean section or not varies tenfold based on one factor alone. Does anyone know what that factor is? Sort of. It's where you went to the hospital, literally the county and state, right? Regional, it shouldn't make any difference at all, right? If I come in and I present with the same set of symptoms or whatever the case may be, I should be treated the same. So tenfold differences from, and this was an amazing study that found this in, if you look at rural Vermont versus New York City, huge differences in practice patterns. And they were driven by a number of different factors, how the doctors worked with one another, what was commonplace. A lot of it was lawsuits, kind of fear of malpractice because cesarean sections don't have nearly the lawsuit incidence that when you don't have a cesarean section does. So healthcare is now leveraging the use of data analytics to try to make practice patterns a lot more consistent so that when you present with a similar set of symptoms, you get the same treatment. Doctors call this cookbook medicine, right? Naturally, they push back on this approach, but at the end of the day, what we all want is better healthcare, and we hope that our doctors want to be practicing better healthcare. And finally, the workforce. Unfortunately, HR has taken its time to get to this point, and these other industries are really mid-transformation. I think workforce and HR is still pretty early in that transformational process, but about 5 years ago, maybe 7, right around the time when Evolve came on the scene, we started seeing HR practitioners talking more and more about using data and analytics, right? These are traditionally people that have not been the most savvy when it comes to empirical methods, but started to realize, based in no small part on examples like Moneyball, that's anecdotal literature, that we can do a better job selecting people, managing them through the use of data than we can based on our gut intuition and instincts, which we've been honing for a number of years. Why now? Really, it's a combination of a number of different factors. I like this quote by Dan O'Reilly, because I think everyone talks about big data and it's this buzzword, but at the end of the day, there's not a lot of specifics out there, and I want to give you guys some specifics about how it's being applied in practice. But so IDC estimated that in the 11 years from 2009 to 2020, that the amount of data that is created is going to multiply by 44 times. To put that in perspective, the amount of data that was created by the internet during its first 10 years of existence, that's now replicated every 2 days, right? A billion of anything is a large number. A billion Google searches ago was, I think it's about an hour ago, right? Huge amounts of data being created over time. And what's more is that companies that are using these analytics best are showing that they demonstrate, first off, higher financial performance. So there was a Bain study that looked at organizational use of analytics and then tried to identify and group them based on how they performed. And they found that organizations that were using analytics, that were adopting them properly, they were 2 times as likely to have top quartile financial performance. They're 5 times more likely to be more agile, to make decisions more quickly. 3 times more likely to execute on those decisions. And twice as likely as to use data when making those decisions. So this translates into dollars and cents. Evolve benefited from this. These are all articles that were written about Evolve or just workforce analytics, but Evolve benefited from this because it came on the scene right around the time that people were really interested in people analytics and HR and workforce analytics. And the idea, again, is that you can use data to make better human resource decisions than your HR managers and recruiters would do on their own. And so some of it was a timing thing, and then some of it was also, to be frank, it was a really sexy topic. It was fun for me to be digging into these issues that matter to the working population, a huge chunk of the population in general. So people are very interested in learning about, well, how my boss may be an algorithm in 10 years from now, or how I might be selected based solely on my responses to an online assessment. So philosophically, I'll walk you guys through this. What we envisioned at Evolve when Max founded it and ultimately as it evolved was a data-driven approach to workforce management. So the bottom panel represents really how things have been done. I'm not sure how the pointer works. Let's see here. There we go. So imagine this bottom panel is how things have been done for just decades and decades. When we choose someone for a job, we're using subjective selection criteria, and people are disqualified based on intuition and bias. People don't realize average recruiter spends an average of 7 seconds on every resume, right? They've got a huge pile of resumes. They need to filter them very quickly. It's crazy to think that they don't miss some of the gold nuggets in those pile of resumes because they're just so focused on doing the job quickly. But even beyond that hiring decision, we know that training is typically done based on what we've done in the past, right? We train people a certain way because that's the way it's done around here. When we try to develop people, they're developed along different trajectories. God knows we could go into performance review as an area that is ripe for opportunity and disruption, and there's some companies that are thinking about that, kind of rethinking the way we evaluate employees. And then when people do leave the organization, we give them an exit survey, but we don't dig in empirically and we don't try to connect everything that they experienced as an employee to the reasons why they're leaving, right? Surveys are useful, but somewhat ineffective. They give you a very one-sided and one-dimensional view of someone's true reasons for departing the organization. And there are better ways to get at that. And so Evolve saw all of this going on and realized that there has to be a better way. And that approach was starting from the very beginning. Through the employee life cycle, we take someone in, and when they apply, we give them an online assessment. And we validated that assessment with industrial organizational psychologists, and we know that that assessment and their responses to that assessment correlate with their outcomes on the job because we've done that legwork. So now we select candidates based on how they respond to that assessment and how they interacted with that test to figure out who's likely to stay longer, who's going to perform better. Those are the people that we hire. When we manage people, we realized as we went along that a huge amount of variation in how long you stayed, how you performed was not really about you. It was about your colleagues. It was tremendously about your manager, right? And so we wanted to make sure that we were pairing people with the right managers. We looked later in the employee life cycle and said, how can we create effective teams? How can we create pairings between employees and managers that are strong? And so ultimately, we went in that direction. We started thinking about coaches. We started thinking about training and optimizing training best practices to get people out of the gate more performing better than they would have otherwise. And then finally, when we talk about performance review, it's not done based on subjective criteria, whether your boss likes you or not, or anything like that, whether he likes the tie you wore to work. It's based on very quantitative and empirical data to suggest that you are truly a good performer, that ultimately you deserve to be promoted, offered raises. And then finally, we did a lot of work around analysis of why people left the organization, and I'll present some of those results later. And so we're not just asking people, well, why'd you leave? We're trying to drill down and understand, well, what are the root causes? What are the things you experienced as an employee from day one to today? And how did each of those factors influence your decision to stay or leave on every day of your employment?
So Max, this story of how Evolve evolved is one that's consistent with some of the topics we've been looking at in this class having to do with economies of scope around data, right? So the initial goal was to answer a very simple question, but in order to answer that question, you needed to organize and collect data. And then once you had that data collected, you realized that that data could reveal the answers to other sorts of questions, which then causes you to acquire a little bit of extra incremental data to help answer that question better. And now you realize that you have the data to answer a third question, and so on. So when we talk about trying to solve a whole host of problems by going to best of breed, vendors who specialize in answering specific questions, that might involve a lot of duplication because they're all going to be kind of tapping into the same data. So just say a few words about how you think these data-driven companies can leverage the economies of scope. You can start trying to answer a small question, and then before you know it, you have the tools to answer larger questions.
Yeah, and actually dovetails. So here, speaking of the data, here we go. So it's funny because where Evolve started was right in here. It was these 4 data silos that we were pulling in order to understand. We were really just focused on assessment, right? We didn't think about later stages of the employee life cycle. The thesis originally was if you hire the right people, hiring is a pain. It's really hard. You get a stack of resumes if you post an ad on Craigslist or Indeed or wherever else, and it's really hard to evaluate people. When you started tackling that problem by gathering these data sources, what we found over time is that we started shifting more to the right. We started gathering additional data sources, and I'll walk through each of these in a second, but we started realizing that what we had in our data warehouse was not just data that would help us solve the hiring problem. We had data that would help us solve the training and supervising and onboarding and all these other problems as well. And so the data integration was definitely a challenge. And again, I'll talk more to that in a second. But the exciting thing is that once we had this data in our warehouses, we were able to identify other factors that were contributing to high or low performance. For me, Greg, The one study that kind of jumps out was we were very focused on psychometric traits, so we would understand someone's personality when they applied. And in the course of doing that work, we also happened to gather information from the resume, and we would identify whether they were a job hopper or not, right? How many jobs they'd had in the past. It's still technically hiring, but that was data that we weren't actively scoring in the assessment. And so I think as we were sitting around as a data science team and doing the same psychometric analyses over and over again, someone asked, well, what about job hopping? Like, does that have an impact on someone's hireability? And so it was one of my more intrepid analysts that thought, hey, I'm going to study this, right? We give them 20% time like Google to really dig into questions they find interesting. And he studied it, and I'm scooping myself because I share this later in the presentation, but we found that job hopping had no discernible relationship with how long someone stayed on the job. So someone's previous work history, whether they'd been unemployed for a long period of time, whether they'd hopped from job to job, that didn't have any sort of correlation with whether they stayed on the job in this next role. It's fascinating. It's kind of counterintuitive. Recruiters looked at us and said, that's crazy. We know that job hoppers continue to hop jobs. But we found through data that that wasn't the case. And it's one of those things where it was completely serendipitous. We didn't set out to gather this information. It's just our system was pulling this information in. Someone had a hypothesis. He had the kind of entrepreneurial spirit enough to engage in that research. We found something that no one else had really discovered. We ended up writing a white paper, releasing this out in the press, and it just kind of got eaten up. People love this stuff. And we realized, holy crap, we're onto something. No one's doing this work, and we have this amazing store of data that no one else has. So more to this issue about data, we started gathering, we needed a control for macroeconomic conditions, so we were getting econometric data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We had assessment data we could either gather from outside providers. Of course, we had our own assessment. That was our core competency. We'd link it up with applicant tracking system and talent management system data, and HRMS, HRIS, human resource information systems like PeopleSoft and Workday and things like that. What we found was that this was really valuable, but we were only tackling one segment of the problem, right? The problem was not, well, it was partially that hiring is a pain in the butt, but the real problem was that people don't stay long in certain jobs, and we were very focused on call centers. These are really, really hard jobs. People are yelling at you day in and day out for things that are beyond your control. And so we saw, in many cases, 100% turnover, 150% turnover. I mean, it's amazing these sort of turnover that you'd see. People would burn out very quickly. So people came to us and they said, our problem is we want to keep people in their seats. We want them to perform well. And we found that hiring was one piece of that problem, but it wasn't everything, because after you've hired that person, you still have to train and onboard them, and you have to supervise them and coach them, and you have to continue to build that relationship. So over time, we started tapping into data from learning management systems, from their CRM. We were measuring how they interacted with customers via their customer experience management system, performance management system as well. We were a little careful about this, so we have the Twitter logo in here. We never actually ended up using Twitter data, but I do know some companies that are using, for example, LinkedIn data to identify flight risks, right? So ultimately, it was this closed loop data process where we were gathering for any given employee. Incredibly hard to maneuver this, but we would gather all data from all these different silos that never spoke to each other, and we were able to create a single consistent identifier so that we could get a picture of you as an employee from before you joined the company all the way through your experience with the company, and then finally once you left, right? And that snapshot, that picture that occurs longitudinally, that was huge because there really wasn't anyone that was able to do that. So everyone touts as I would go and speak with the press, and we talk about the machine learning. I hate to say it, I don't want to undercut Evolve, but that wasn't the real secret sauce. It's hard to do, but these days there's a lot of data science out there. There are a lot of amazing publicly available tools. The real secret sauce was this data integration piece. This is incredibly hard to get right, to get that picture of someone's experience at the company. And so that was basically the core that sit here, starting with our big data machine learning. We had workforce science layered on top of it. That's a code for industrial organizational psychology, asking the right questions that get at someone's true preferences, rather than asking questions that have a socially desirable response. There are a lot of assessment vendors out there that if I ask you, hey, how many days a week is it okay to be late to work, right? We all know the answer to that question. It's very transparent. So we would get at more kind of values-driven questions. We'd ask you, do you like to meet new people and experience new things, or do you think it's always important to follow the rules, right? And things like that. And only we, quite frankly, only the algorithms would know the right answer to that question. We designed it in a way where it was hard for us to even know until we adjudicated that question by combining it with outcomes data. So we start layering on top of these systems. We built a realistic job preview. We found that the best way to know whether someone is a good fit for the job is to actually infer from their own opinion themselves. We would try to scare them a little bit. We did ask them questions about, are you okay being in an intense work environment and having difficult interactions with customers? And when people wanted to opt out, they weren't in the interview, they didn't have to excuse themselves, say they were going to the bathroom and run out the door, they could click out of their browser. And so we found that was a good way for people to self-select. But then ultimately we would administer a battery of different personality tests and skills tests. Those would change over time. The right responses could potentially change over the course of several weeks or months. It really just depended on what the outcomes told us. We scored and prioritized candidates based on how they did on those personality tests. And then ultimately we rendered those results to recruiters and hiring managers so they could make the right decision about their people. So the good news is when people use the system, it worked. So here are a few examples. This is a survival curve. I'm not sure if you guys have covered that. I know you did like some logistic work. Survival curve is pretty simple. This is on the x-axis is how long until an event occurs, in this case, termination, either voluntary or involuntary. This is percent of survival or probability of survival. On day one, everyone starts on the job. As time elapses, people leave. You'll notice in this case, you're losing 5 to 10% of people within 45 days. So this is non-trivial turnover. You don't see that in jobs likely that all of you have, but these are hard jobs. And so people are leaving very quickly. And lo and behold, when we would assign a color-coded score that was green, yellow, or red. The idea, obviously, that greens stay longer than yellows, yellows stay longer than reds. We see the same direction for performance. This is the baseline. This is what was going on before Evolve came on the scene. And what we saw was that we were able to successfully identify those people that were likely to stay on the job longer. If you were a green, you were significantly more likely to stay on the job than if you were a yellow. We looked at performance. So net promoter score is basically a fancy term for customer satisfaction. Unfortunately, with this client, the rates start low. You get out of training on day 15. The scores actually start relatively low. So this is 38% net promoter. It's not great. And what's more is that these are really hard jobs, so people kind of get worse in this role, which is not ideal. But the good news is the blue is the baseline, when people came from Evolve system and were scored a green, they did significantly better on net promoter score than if they were scored a yellow, and there aren't any reds to report here.
So when you're trying to convince the client of the value proposition, did they simply do this before and after, or did you also have them do A/B tests, right? So I think you have them hire their own candidates for half the workforce and then use your engine for the other half, or, so that you're doing like a true comparison.
Yeah, it was a challenge. So an A/B test is hard to administer, and we did that in some cases. For the most part, we would do a before and after study, but before and after is subject to criticisms. Well, what other things were going on in that center before you implemented Evolve and after, right? And were we doing a lot of other initiatives that you guys are taking credit for? So in those cases, for customers that were more skeptical, we would do a randomized A/B trial. In one case, we did 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, right? So we'd score applicants for 2 weeks, and then we'd turn off the system for 2 weeks. And then we'd turn it back on 2 weeks later, and we would see how those two groups compared. And the Evolve hires when the hiring decision was made with that color-coded score, they stayed longer. The challenge is, A, it's hard to coordinate, and B, quite frankly, we didn't love to get in the habit of turning our system off, right? We didn't want, we're a vendor, we're ultimately trying to get customers, and so we didn't love that idea, and that's why, as quickly as possible, if we had to do a pilot, once we would do that pilot, and we could show graphs like these that showed that the system was working, we try to transition to, okay, this is clearly working, let's talk long-term. We want to build a relationship and a partnership over the course of many years. Yep.
So when you approach a new customer, how do you monetize it? By that, what I mean is that this whole data infrastructure takes time. The results also take time. So does the customer invest in this technology upfront, or is it performance-based? Like essentially there's this problem with data science that you have to kind of wait for the models to be trained and things like that, right? So how do you overcome that in your previous company's business model and the new company's business model?
Yeah, it was a challenge, and that's partially because, well, the downside is when you're banking on turnover and survival, if that was the metric they were most concerned with, that takes time to evolve, right? You might have to wait 6 months. You have to do a certain amount of hiring. We found it was about 300 hires to show that it was working, and then you had to wait 3, 6 months, sometimes even longer, to see if it was working, to be able to come up with charts like these that you could show to the client. So that was part of the challenge in selling, quite frankly, to HR professionals. The other challenge was that in the cases that they were more skeptical, it was very hard to monetize this, right? So the other challenge, and this is some of the things that Evolve was up against, these are kind of soft ROI improvements, right? So let's say we are successful in keeping people around longer and your turnover reduces by 20%. We'd have many conversations with customers where they would say, okay, where's this money, right? You promised me a big bag of money, where's the money? And what we tried to explain was that the money is kind of hidden, right? It's hidden in recruiting costs. Your recruiters don't have to vet as many applicants. It's hidden in the training costs, right? There are not as many people that have to go through training. You're having fewer training courses. There are a lot of, and then of course customers, churn is lower, right? But then we actually would, in some cases, get down to like a accounting statement. I'd look at a P&L and try to figure out, okay, based on the models I've run, where is this money hiding, and how did their statements compare to last year's statements? And that was a challenge because we wanted to be able, at least if the agents were sales facing, at least with sales you can say, okay, if you're better at sales, pretty obvious, it's very easy to show a dollar value that's associated with that. When you're talking about cost reduction versus revenue enhancement, it's a much harder sell. And that's part of the challenge, quite frankly, for Evolve was, I believe in my core, it worked. We would reduce churn. In spite of that, it was very, very hard to get people to make that decision to buy because of this. And because, quite frankly, HR is resource constrained and they're not the empowered buyer that you typically would like if you were selling a software solution. Make sense? Yep. Mm-hmm. For the most part, yeah.
So most of these employees are kind of very homogeneous. So the same survey questionnaire you can use for all of them. If you go to other employees, like to executives, technical people, I imagine that the surveys that you are using and this tool should be very specialized for each of them. And the cost of the retention cost of any of them leaving for the company should be higher. What do you think that you can do for that one? I mean, how easy is that to use the same tool for rest of the employees in the company?
Yeah, so we wouldn't use the same tool. A lot of this was call center work, but we actually engaged with some office workers as well, front admin, executive assistant, stuff like that. Different assessment for those individuals than if you were a call center employee, right? You use a different set of tools, obviously. The challenge with those is part of the power of this is in the power of big data, right? Gathering lots and lots of data from lots of different personalities and outcomes to try to triangulate what are the traits and attributes that make someone a good fit. So if you're talking about more nuanced roles, I've seen companies that have tried to apply the same approach to hiring anything, data scientists and engineers all the way up to CEOs. And the challenge there is there aren't tens of thousands out there that you can evaluate consistently and then figure out. You want homogeneous roles, you want people doing the same role, and you want a lot of them because that's ultimately what enables us to do some really cool empirical work.
But the thing about homogeneous roles is that they are easily replaceable. If somebody leaves the call center, you can easily replace it with somebody else. The ones that they are not homogeneous, that we cannot use these tools for them, they are the ones that lots of costs associated if they are leaving.
Yep.
That's the main thing, I think.
Yeah, that is the challenge, is these roles, typically people are getting paid $22,000 a year. So the cost savings that you could extrapolate is small. If you could keep an executive in their role longer, that obviously is associated with, headhunters will charge, tens of thousands to find someone for these roles. However, it's the kind of catch-22. You also don't get enough data to be able to really fine-tune the assessments. So I think Evolve did have aspirations to kind of move up the value chain, but most of the work we did was around call centers. That was really the niche we found because there's a lot of data, a lot of homogeneous positions, and ultimately that was kind of where we were able to find the best fit. So great points, that's exactly right. So I won't beat you guys too much over the head. Productivity is measured in this world via average handle time. Typically you want to see it drop, and here we do, right? Average handle time drops, that means you're handling calls and inquiries more quickly. This was the baseline. We see here again, the greens start off better, and they're better throughout than the yellows or the reds likely would have been. So this was validated. Actually, there was some really cool empirical research that was done and is bouncing around right now amongst some top tier economic journals. And they use data from a provider of assessment services for large companies that I am not technically allowed to name. But what they did is they looked at the impact of a job testing provider on turnover, on days of employment. And they found two things. One, these are not surprising given what I just shared with you, but first, if you were in the high scoring group, you would stay significantly longer than if you were in this middle group or the low scoring group, right? So pre-employment tests do work. They on average predict that hired workers will have a longer tenure. But what's more is that they found that what happened when recruiters said, F this, I'm gonna use my own judgment. I've been doing this for 10 years. And by the way, we encountered this all the time. Recruiters would say, I know how to do my job. This is a machine that doesn't know what it's talking about. I'm gonna just trust my own judgment. And they would often ignore the scores. And then we'd have to talk to their manager, or we'd have to try to incentivize them. It was really a challenge, was that behavioral modification. And what this study found was that when people did that, and there was a 1 standard deviation increase in what they call the exception rate, that's the rate with which I say, nope, not right, I know what I'm doing. What they found was that those employees had 5% reduction in job tenures, right? So it said you should follow the recommendations on average. So then the natural conclusion, I think, of this is you might jump to the conclusion of saying, well, why do we even need the people? If the computer is almost always right, why do we even have recruiters in these roles in the first place? And from our perspective, there were actually two reasons to do that. Number one is that humans are better at picking up on certain things than machines are. And what I mean by that is, if you look at companies, there are actually companies that are doing this with video interviewing, and they pick up on facial cues, and they pick up on tonality. And the interesting thing is that there are, anecdotally, and I've heard sort of in the research, that they miss certain cues that a human being would pick up on. And any of us have had an interaction with someone where you think to yourself, that it was just kind of off. It felt weird. I don't know what it was, but it felt weird. Those are the things that computers are really bad at. And the example, it was actually put to me in a very clear way when we were talking to a recruiter with a large temp company. They place hundreds of thousands of accountants and office workers in jobs. And they insist on doing an in-person interview with every applicant, right? Video interviewing won't cut it. And we asked them, well, why do you do that? It costs you a lot more money and time. Bring people in the office and kind of have to run them through tests. And they said, you know what? A robot is not going to be able to tell me if the candidate smells bad, right? It sounds silly, but like these are things where, as human beings, we're actually attuned to certain elements that, at least for the foreseeable future, machines aren't going to be able to really give us a good readout on. The second concern is actually something that I testified to the EEOC about a couple months ago, and this is just general concern. When you train an algorithm to pick the best employees based on all the training data that you've given it, it's going to recommend the best employees. But what if there's bias implicit in the data? So the EEOC is very concerned about situations where you work in an office where, because of the culture or the way that it's configured, white males just succeed. They jump to the top of the ladder very, very quickly. So what happens if I train an algorithm to tell me who's going to be the best employee in any given role? Right? It's going to recommend inadvertently, even if I don't tell it your race or your gender or your age, it's going to identify traits that make you likely to succeed. And those are likely going to be picking the white males.
So, I've talked to some of the folks at Google People Ops, and, when they're trying to predict success in different, in job roles, the target feature they would use oftentimes would be peer evaluation, right? So if peer evaluation is your target feature, as opposed to some more objective performance metric, then your model is simply going to, find the people that the supervisors think are good, as opposed to potentially the ones that are good in some objective way. And so that's one of the problems. If you don't have an objective measure of productivity, and you simply have how quickly did they advance up the ladder, or how well were they evaluated by their supervisors, what's the alternative to that? How do you correct for that in the absence of objective performance metrics?
Yeah, it's a challenge. The answer, from my perspective, the answer is you have to come up with some objective measures, even tenure. So, you can think turnover, that's something every organization tracks, but think of the example I just gave, right? If you're, not to use a bad example, like a woman working at Uber, it's likely that your tenure was shortened because of all the things you were experiencing, and that's ultimately going to bias these algorithms. So unfortunately, we're constrained by the data we have. I completely agree that subjective measures like performance reviews and promotion rates, those are really murky. I'd be very careful. But what's unfortunate and concerning is that even objective measures that you would think, okay, measuring someone's absenteeism or presenteeism or tenure or their performance on the job as measured by customer satisfaction or sales conversion, even those you need to be a little careful of, because those might not be completely untainted either, right? And that's why we actually think arming human beings with this information and having them make these decisions, yeah, it could potentially reinforce biases if they inadvertently tend to prefer someone who went to Harvard and played squash, because that's what they're like. But we also think it can correct for some of the biases that might be present in the system, just by training it based on, I want the best employee possible. It's a great question. This is literally, they're a little late to the game, I hate to say it. The EEOC kind of, I think, a couple months ago realized, holy crap, these assessments are everywhere and we haven't touched this. So we need to figure out how to think about this very fast. So they called a bunch of experts in and they started chatting with us, and I think they're going to be making some interesting moves in the coming months, because they're really concerned, especially by algorithms, that it's one thing if someone's in the funnel and they're in the funnel, but there are algorithms right now that are pinging you for jobs, right? And now there's no way for me to know who was pinged for a job and who wasn't. And was that decision to send a message to one person and not another, was that biased? So I can't even use data to figure out, was there explicit bias here? I don't know who the decision set was. So I'll back up. So this is a little bit tangential, but one of the cool things about working with Evolve is that we got our hands on all sorts of data that no one else was able to get access to. So as Greg had mentioned, we ended up building this whole line of research and publishing some of those articles that I mentioned. And so I'm going to share some really cool tidbits. This is totally independent of the man versus machine conversation. It's just cocktail party conversation that might interest you guys. So first off, number one factor in determining whether you stay on your job or whether you leave. Anyone know? Boss. Yep, I kind of gave it away. I jumped ahead. It's your boss. We found that your manager influences the employee tenure more than any other factor, in fact, combined. And so this, I think it was 54% of your tenure is influenced by relationships in general, with your boss, with your coworkers, but the boss was the single biggest driver. And so when people would come to us, that was why we thought, initially we thought, get the right talent in the door, everything will take care of itself. By the end, we realized, nope, it's not about the one, it's about the group. We need to optimize that group in order to show that we're making an impact. Anyone else? So on the same vein, when we're talking about relationships, what's the other biggest impact, biggest driver of tenure and performance? This one's a tougher one. CEO honesty. That's interesting. Leadership, it was hard for us to measure leadership, right? It's really hard to get empirical facts about that. What we could measure was who was on your team, and specifically we could measure why they left. And we were able to identify toxic employees by virtue of the termination reason codes for their departure. So things like fraud, sexual harassment, drug and alcohol abuse, misconduct, really bad stuff. We found if you're on a team with a toxic employee, or even if there's one on the same floor as you, you are many orders of magnitude more likely to leave your job. And again, this is fascinating from the perspective, research, no one's done this work before, and we're now making it's making its way through publication. Anyone I talk to in the audiences, they're like, really, you had to do a multi-year study to figure this out, that if you're on a team with an asshole, that you tend to hate your job and you want to leave? Like, no huge surprise.
Employees, who is toxic?
Yeah, so we were only able to do it after the fact. So when we observed why they left the job, we would get termination reason codes, right? And some were terminated for things like job abandonment or personal reasons. But in 3 to 5% of those terminations, we saw that they were terminated for something we consider toxic, which is drug and alcohol abuse, misconduct, fraud, sometimes like sexual harassment or physical intimidation of employees, really bad stuff. So we made a leap and we assumed those people, those are toxic employees. And we looked, and then we backtracked. We knew why they left. Now let's look at who they interacted with when they were on the job. What teams were they on? Did they manage people, right? We're going back in time and trying to figure out, I mentioned before, we had that life history of their experience at the company. And we found that everywhere they went, bad stuff happened. People left, people performed worse. We did some separate research I'm not going to highlight today where we looked at spatial effects, found just where you sit. If you sit next to a high performer, you become a high performer. Right? You actually trade, you trade performance across multiple KPIs. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Marrying this up, I mean, obviously you'd want to avoid even hiring that employee in the first place. So in your work through either some of the psychological testing or questions and answers, have you identified effective ways or some way directionally to be able to filter those? And I'm thinking, some of the comprehensive tests like DISC or otherwise have a little bit, salient elements, but if you could expand on that.
Yeah. Really hard to do. For example, we had a question on the assessment about rule following, and we would ask them in a somewhat opaque way, in a somewhat transparent way, we would ask them, are you a rule follower? And the results were across the board, toxic employees always said, yep, always follow the rules. Never disobey the rules. We know that that's not the case. So mea culpa, we learned our lesson, which you don't ask someone directly. One thing that was really interesting, though, is we got a little clever about it. And so we asked, instead of saying, do you follow the rules, or are you honest, we would ask them early in the assessment, hey, could you self-assess your technical skills? How good are you with a keyboard and mouse? How good's your typing? Do you feel comfortable with a computer in front of you? Things like that. And then once they went later in the assessment, after they couldn't go back, we would test them, right? We would test their typing skills. We'd ask them, what's the shortcut for copying and pasting text in a word processing program? What's the unique address given to every computer on the internet? What's the name of that? And so when we did it that way, and we compared their actual technical proficiency to their self-assessed technical proficiency, that was where we found two groups that were very, very clearly different. One group was relatively honest, they were what they said they were, and the other group was, let's say, creative, right? They said, yeah, I'm a software engineer in my spare time, and then when we asked them, well, how fast do you, when we tested them, they typed 5 words per minute, right? So that construct, that was one example of when we looked at that, those people who we would call, I won't call them dishonest, let's say they were overconfident, they were much, much more likely to be a toxic employee. So we had to get a little creative about measures like that. Yep.
So what kind of industries and what kind of jobs do you use for this research? And the other thing was, it seems like both of these, like both the toxic employees and the boss could be kind of like a proxy for company culture. So how do you like back out this company culture from your data?
Yeah, culture is really difficult, and it's so hard to get your arms around. I spent many years doing employee engagement assessments and things like that. So there was no real way. The only way we could get at culture was measuring across multiple workplaces, right, and trying to normalize it that way, and understanding, do certain companies tend to employ people that have certain personalities? Beyond that, but as far as how we would test it, the answer is lots and lots of data of people doing almost the same exact job, right? We'd have this massive network, call center employees located, some in the US, some offshore, some in India, Asia, Philippines, some even in Europe. But we knew they were doing, in many cases, they were doing the same work. Customer care and customer service, some sales, some were doing technical support. And when we combine data from all these dozens of companies and we end up with sample sizes that are in the 10 and sometimes hundreds of thousands, then some of these trends would really jump out. They would emerge. But I mentioned that the long pole in the tent is not the analysis, it's the gathering all those different data feeds, right? Because how they classify termination codes could vary significantly from one company to the next. So I want to make sure I have time to talk about some of the work we're doing now. I mentioned this before. So job hoppers, the unemployed, they make great hires. Somewhat counterintuitive. That was what sent us down this path. And then honesty can be measured, not in transparent ways like we tried originally, but when we got creative, we found honest employees were better at every KPI we could capture except for one, and that one metric was sales conversion. And this is typically where I tell everyone to make their own joke about that one. So speaking of sales, so first off, that was workforce analytics. That was the playbook that Evolve had. Successful exit, got acquired by Cornerstone, largely for the IP and all the analytics that we had built up. And my experience, I loved working with Max at Evolve, but there were some takeaways for me. I thought, you know what, data science has the power to completely transform work processes. I believe in that it's human and machine and not human or machine. And what I learned also was that HR is challenging. And when you're selling yourself as a cost reduction tool, it's a lot more difficult than selling yourself as a revenue enhancement tool. And so with those three things in mind, and also data integration is hard, so I want to capture as little data as possible, because we became more of a services, almost consulting company by virtue of that integration work than it was a true product company. So noodling on that for a couple years, I decided I'm going to build another platform that leverages data science and analytics in an area that I personally am very interested in, which is language and communication. And so to set the stage, I've co-founded Rapport Boost with a few colleagues of mine, having seen a couple of changes in the market. First off, mobile phones are everywhere. And not only that, but people are using their phones to buy things. 66% of mobile users have bought a product in the last week. Number two, Gen Y and millennials, they interact very, very differently than folks, I guess, in my generation and older, right? They don't like to pick up the phone. And they're not big fans of email either. Love to chat and message. You can see that reflected in dating in the current day, right? No one picks up the phone anymore and calls. Everyone likes to do chat and messaging. Well, what's interesting to me is that companies that are spending millions and millions of dollars on optimizing their funnel. Everyone knows about the funnel, and we want customers start at the top. And we want to get a lot of people in the top, and so we're going to optimize landing pages, and we're going to optimize our Facebook page, and we're going to optimize our website, and we're going to optimize our email outbound campaigns. We're going to A/B test subject lines and all that stuff. And companies have adopted that wholeheartedly to the top of the funnel. And then once someone engages, they say, okay, we're going to leave this up to random chance. We're going to hope that we trained our people well enough to engage properly. And I saw that and I thought, this seems silly, right? You would think that that same approach to A/B testing and optimizing should continue from the day someone interacts with you, from the day in which they either buy a product or they come back again and continue buying your services. And so anticipating that bots were going to really, really take over in e-commerce, and I'm a big believer in conversational commerce, we thought, well, listen, bots aren't there yet. The ecosystem is very early. What we're going to do is we're going to build a EQ command platform, and we're going to help human agents with their EQ. We're going to help them build rapport. Some are good, some aren't so good. Coaching is a pain. QA is very, very challenging. We're going to make humans even better at building relationships.
Could you tell everybody who don't know what EQ is?
Sorry, yeah. So EQ is essentially emotional intelligence, right? So there are different, according to some theories, there are different forms of intelligence, and we all think of it as someone's book smart or they're people smart, but there are people we all know who are just very, very adept. I'm sure there's some in this room who are just really good at picking up on subtle cues and on interrelating with people, love to build relationships that are really, really good at that stuff. I am not one of those. I tend to be a little bit more academic, but I think this is a learnable skill, or at least something that with tools we can all get better at, right? So the idea is when you're talking to someone and you're interacting, there's kind of two things occurring, right? There's information being transferred back and forth, But there's also these subtle nuances. There's rapport that we're building, right? I'm interacting with you. I'm taking note of your physical cues, your body language, your tonality, and I'm engaging with you and kind of mirroring those. Some are better at that, some are worse at that. All the bot makers that are out there, they're really focused on the content. They're really ensuring that when someone asks a question, I deliver the right content to them so that I've answered their question and I've made them happy. What we saw was that no one's thinking about EQ. And what I'll show in a second is that that EQ matters more to you in terms of that interaction and its outcome than the actual information that was conveyed, right? Whether I walk away happy or sad, it's not as much a matter of did I get the question answered, it's really a matter of did that person relate to me and make me feel like I was valued and cherished, and did we build a relationship? And so that's the value proposition for Rapport Boost is we are providing emotional intelligence to conversational commerce. The idea is we use machine learning. You hand us large corpus of data, chat and messaging data. You hand us some metric of success, some KPI indicating did someone churn, did they buy a product, did they give a positive customer satisfaction score? And what we ultimately do is train our algorithms to help human agents be more human, to help them engage with customers and provide a better experience. And ultimately, the long-term goal is not just to help humans, it's to help machines. We're going to take everything we've learned from our human agents, and we're working with a lot of them now, and we're going to tell bots how to engage with you in a more authentic way. So this might, oh, sorry, go ahead.
That sounds counterintuitive, that you can somehow codify emotional intelligence and kind of make it work. So I understand that the problem, but emotions are like culture, right? It's so difficult to figure out exactly what defines EQ. So can you talk more about that, as in why emotional intelligence? Because it's so difficult to actually implement.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
You know, when you're talking about chats, right, it seems like with chats, the emotional cues are missing, right? So, you know, I know if I send an email and I say, hey, you know, where are you? People hear, hey, where the hell are you, right? And you know, it seems to have more to do with the mood that the reader is in than to do with the actual cues that are contextualized in the message.
Yeah. So it is a challenge, to be sure, because when we're engaging with chat and messaging, we're missing all the physical language, right? 93% of communication is physical. It's tonality, it's body language, it's how I'm interacting with you. Did I raise my voice? What was my inflection? You lose all of that with chat. But there is still a component of chat, there's a big component of chat that is EQ and rapport enabled. And so it's no question, it's a hard thing to do. Picking up on things like sarcasm is really, really hard to do. But it's not impossible. And in fact, there are now libraries become available. Sentiment analysis is kind of old news. That's been done by a number of different companies. There are a lot of APIs that do it. But yeah, we're absolutely able to get into the nuances of sarcasm because there's data on Reddit where sarcastic comments are tagged. So I can use machine learning to identify sarcasm that's occurring. There's studies that identify one of the ways that I know if you're pissed in a text, you send one word. There's a huge difference between sending me one word, like okay, and then one word and a period, right? It sounds crazy, but like the latter denotes that I'm a lot angrier. This is what we find in our studies. When you do that, that's a sign of, that's kind of a show of aggression, right? So no question it's hard. That's why the system picks up on hundreds and hundreds of variables and is looking at all of these different attributes in order to render a decision to that chat agent about is the customer happy or are they unhappy? How best should you engage with them? Or what's the optimal word length? How many questions should you be asking? Are they someone who speaks with very formal tone, with complete sentences, periods, and capitals? Or is it someone that is engaging with a lot of LOL and LMFAO and using a lot of shorthand, right? Chat messaging is a real challenging medium, but there's huge opportunities there if you can relate to someone and mirror their language back to them. And so that's essentially how we built this system. And so some of this should actually be very familiar based on what I chatted with Greg about. Starts with a data warehouse. The good news here is we're not gathering data from 10 different sources. We're gathering basically 6 fields. The message, who's it from, who's it to, when was it sent, what was the message? And then I need a 5th field, which is how successful was it? How successful was the conversation? Did I make a sale? How big was the sale? Did someone give me a positive customer satisfaction score? So learn from the lessons of Evolve. There's a lot of this borrowed from the playbook with some slight tweaks. Didn't want to do massive data integrations. I wanted as little data as possible. Of course, one of those fields is the message itself. That's where the trick is can I interpret a message via machine learning and algorithms? But I'd rather that be the challenge than can I get data from 20 different systems to speak to one another? Feature engineering, this is the hardest part. Keyword extraction, extracting the right keywords, not just single words, looking at different phrases, 2 grams, 3 grams, looking at different interactions of phrases, clustering messages based on their topic. So what is it I'm inquiring about? Am I inquiring about a product? Do I have a question about billing? I have to separate those conversations. Timing, we want to make sure that timing matters because people care. If it takes 10 seconds or 10 minutes to respond to my message, that's going to produce a very different outcome. We take all of that data, we insert it into our machine learning algorithm, we do analyses at the conversation level, predicting a conversational outcome, as well as the message level. We can predict whether the response to my message is going to be positive or negative, if you're going to use 1 word or you're going to use 20. Overnight, we generate these classifiers, and these classifiers are really the brains of the system. It's basically our assessment of best practices. What separates a good conversation from a bad one? Those classifiers then generate scores, recommendations, and feedback for a human agent. This is key. This is our human in the loop system. And we're now developing an autocorrect. You type something in, it didn't instead of changing your spelling, grammar, or punctuation, it changes kind of the tone, sentiment, and it maybe adds a smiley face at the end. Right? And then ultimately, it's reading this conversation in real time. From the visitor, it's gathering information about their location and their browser, but it's learning. Every time I communicate with you as a visitor to a site or an app, I'm sharing something about my personality, right? And we all make these judgments without even knowing it, subconsciously. But the system is now learning, okay, what's the personality? Is this a 40-year-old businessman? Is this a 14-year-old teenage girl? And it's learning and adapting over time. And so that's really how we built the system. Engage with customers in 3 ways. One is this backward-looking analysis. Give us a data dump. Wait 90 days. We're going to come back to you and tell you what are best practices. What are the things you're doing right? What are the things you're doing wrong? We're going to give you insights about how to train your agents. Now, instead of doing that analysis one time, we do in phase 2 kind of an after-the-fact coach. So the coach basically appears either after the chat is concluded, end of the day, end of the week, end of the month, depending on the customer's preferences, and says, hey, these are the things you're doing well. You seem to be very friendly. You seem to be putting in the effort, but your emotion seems to be low. You could be showing a little bit more emotion. Here are some examples of transcripts where showing a little bit more emotion might have actually had a really big impact on the outcome. And eventually where we're going, so we don't have this yet, though there is a demo, is real-time feedback. It's not after the chat is done. It's not, I'm going to give you an analysis in 90 days. It is as the conversation's occurring, we're giving that human agent feedback and insight into what they're doing right and wrong, and we're helping them course correct. And of course, that API will eventually feed into bots and be sort of a bot add-on. We think of it as turbocharging a bot with EQ. So I'll show you an example. It's hard to understand how this works. Let me give you an example of a customer that we engage with. Medium-sized customer, so they're an online retailer doing e-commerce, about 25 million in annual revenue, highly competitive market. These guys have 20 chat agents during the year. They ramp up and almost double during the holidays. So this is largely seasonal work. A lot of what they're doing is project-based, right? It's, imagine putting a photo on a throw pillow, mug, or blanket for one of your loved ones. A lot of their business comes in November and December. And so training that population of chat agents is very, very hard. Doing QA, maintaining levels of quality and that brand voice is incredibly challenging when all of their business basically comes in 2 months of the year. So they gave us a bunch of chat data. It's consisted of about 200,000 visits. Again, medium-sized data set, but certainly enough to draw some insights. 3 million messages. They first and foremost were concerned with customer satisfaction surveys. They wanted to make sure that they were providing top-tier service, better than any of their competitors. And those feedback surveys were categorized within overall, as well as evaluations of friendliness, knowledge, and responsiveness. But then later, having seen the results, they said, okay, well, what about orders? They gave us data on 1.4 million product orders, order size on average in the range of $70. About 35% of chats resulted in a sale. So they gave us all this data. We didn't have to integrate with any of the systems. And we categorized the data. We did all that keyword analysis. Very quickly, we think of our world as things you can control, things you can control and things you cannot control. So non-rapport boost, this is agent demographics. How many people are chatting at any given time? What's the learning curve? What's the chat volume? We're looking at visitor demographics. When they hit us up, where they're coming from, what part of the country they're in, number of times they visited. These are all visitor stats, as well as the message topic. We did some clustering of topics. But we think there are 4 variables that are very much within the control of the agent. Number 1, effort. We call there are dozens of variables that fall in this bucket, but things like formal language, am I asking enough questions? What's my word count? How long are the words I'm using? Am I using a 6th or 8th grade reading level? Friendliness, use of words like I, we, you, assent words, gotcha, totally, cool. All these things have a big impact in terms of my customer experience. Responsiveness, it's pretty intuitive. When I respond more quickly to you or I respond more slowly, that can have an impact on the outcome. And then finally, emotion, using, of course, all those sentiment analysis APIs I mentioned, but also looking for things like exclamation marks, positive emotion, negative emotion, emoticons, am I laughing at your jokes? This is all rapport building tools. So what drives customer satisfaction? For this customer, we found effort was the #1 driver. And so maybe not surprising. When I feel like a valued customer, when you're investing the effort in my conversation and not giving me one-word answers, I walk away with a better experience. Number 2, friendliness. Okay, did I perceive that you were friendly or were you just kind of cold and robotic with me? Responsiveness is 3rd. Then we see some stuff that I mentioned is really out of the control of those agents. Why did I chat with you? How much experience do I have as an agent? And what's my shift look like? What part of the country are you coming from? And when in the day have you sent me a message? Then things like emotion, we get back to questions, offering sympathy. So now we're able to figure out, well, what matters? What matters to order behavior? Again, effort seems to matter most to both of these, both conversion rates as well as order size. But in the case of conversions, friendliness matters a ton. Then it's what it is that that person wants to talk about, followed by responsiveness. We see emotion here is at 6.9%.
So think of a more commercial application, which is some kind of email sentiment gauge. So when you're about to send an email, you get a thing that flashes, don't send this email, because an ordinary person is going to think you're a jerk if you send this email. And so and it could offer you ways of modifying that email. I could see this being a very valuable intra-office product.
Yeah. We get that question all the time. I think electronic communication in general is fair game. Like we absolutely have aspirations to be thinking about emails. Emails are more challenging because long-form emails are harder to parse than a short-form text. Right? Think about it. When I text with you, I send a sentence or 2, I get an instant interaction. I get feedback almost immediately.
And you could also have something for cross-cultural, right? So there's so many cross-cultural misunderstandings that you could be writing an email to a colleague with different nationality, and it says, hey, this isn't going to work with someone from that country.
That's quite frankly my dream, is right now US focused, but I think there's so many cross-cultural differences and miscommunications that occur because someone who is from Brazil or Japan interacts differently. There's so many studies that show they think and act differently and interact differently than someone who's born in the US. And I think if we can put ourselves in someone else's shoes and understand how they interact because of their cultural values, we can provide a better experience, we can get along better. The inter-office thing I think is fascinating, and we have to resist the temptation to go and integrate with Slack, because we're just trying to stay very narrowly focused, but no question they're huge. I get the question every time, which is, oh my God, everyone's had office disputes, quarrels, or something they sent was misinterpreted. They want to know, well, how can we avoid that, right? And I absolutely see that application. And again, I won't beat you guys over the head too much with this, but look, just a 10% improvement across those 4 categories I mentioned, right? I'm not talking about turning your worst agent into their best. We're just saying, you know what if you make a 10% improvement across a variety of different categories? Again, effort was driving the most change, and so lo and behold, 10% improvement in effort yields a 12% improvement in total order size. Comparable figures across sales conversions. We see a 1.4% improvement in emotion, Friendliness drives a 2% improvement into order size, responsiveness about 3%. So in total, if you improve by 10%, you're gonna get something actually pretty close to about 20% increase in order size. When you add that up with sales conversion, where we see similar numbers, what that means is that by just training people to engage the right way and helping them build that rapport, we saw for this customer a 50% revenue enhancement, right? Huge dollar value just by saying, let's not even worry about teaching you more about the product. Let's just make sure that you're equipped to handle customers the right way, to show them that they're valued, to speak authentically, and to engage with them in a way where you're building a relationship. So I'll jump ahead. So here's the cool thing. I mentioned we do some topic analysis. These are the keywords that were the best. When the customer sent you this keyword, you knew it was going to be a good conversation. No surprise. Okay, thank you, great, perfect, help. Awesome, cool, wonderful, nice, wow, amazing, perfect. No surprises there. Well, what about the worst keywords? Right? They want to do root cause analysis. What are the keywords where we're really bad? Number one, mail, mailing, unsubscribe, postcards. Okay, clearly there's a mailing issue here. This isn't how you engage, this is what you're doing to fix your business. Overlapping, shuffling photos. Again, this is another one where they've actually done some digging to try to figure out other issues with the system in terms of avoiding overlap of photos. So I want to do one fun exercise. Assuming everyone's heard of deep learning neural nets, have you guys, obviously you won't go into a ton of detail, but they're familiar with the concept, right? Okay, so deep learning neural nets, basically they pick up on patterns in the conversation. As humans, we can't interpret what the machine is thinking, but it sees the same pattern over and over, and it deduces, okay, what's gonna come next? Or is this gonna be a good outcome or a bad? So what concerns me, I'm a little bit of a critic of deep learning, and I'll explain to you why, but we have some deep learning that we've built into the system, and this is somewhat what came out of it. So look at this conversation with angry visitors we've labeled. This is in our demo system, right? Every time I try to place an order, your site breaks. All I want to do is buy something. I can't even do that. Person's trying to be nice. I'm really sorry to hear that. What are you trying to purchase? Just widget 1 and widget 2. We had to change the names to anonymize the company. Why is it so hard? So first off, where would you say this score, where is this person in terms of feedback survey from 0 to 100? Where do you think they're going to land? What's that? Yeah, pretty close to 0. Actually, the system gives it a score. This was a little high. We've recalibrated. Now it actually puts it somewhere closer to 35%. Not impossible to salvage, but this is definitely not going the great way. So what do you think is the one recommendation that this system would give to the human agent that says, okay, this is where you messed up and this is how you need to improve? So it's hard to guess. I'll show you, which is the system says, don't apologize. So why would it say that? Right? That seems crazy. Why would you not apologize? Well, when we taught the system, we'll look for bad keywords from agents, right? What are the worst things you can say to a customer? This is one of the clusters that came up. Inconvenience, apologize, sorry, delay, confusion, hassle, trouble, caused.
Well, so how do you know that's not reverse causation, right? So in other words, it's not that the word is causing an unsatisfactory outcome, but those words typically appear when there's a bad situation happening, right?
That is exactly the case. That is 100% why this occurred, and also why I'm skeptical a little bit of deep learning and neural nets. Because when you draw relationships between what you're seeing in the conversation and the outcome, you're not establishing causation. The system doesn't understand the difference between causation and correlation. It sees bad outcome, it sees, oh crap, almost every time there's a bad outcome, there's an apology going on. The answer is don't ever apologize, right? Just tell them to suck it up. So that's why, if there's one piece of wisdom I can give to everyone, it's the human and the machine, right? You need to establish causation, because otherwise a system that was trained based on this and just let out into the wild, and don't worry, this was not an interaction where we actually did this live, because we're very careful about this. You want to make sure that it's not offering up recommendations that just try to reverse engineer the outcome. You want to make sure that it's truly saying, I've A/B tested, and I know that apologizing is effective, or maybe it's not as effective as offering them free shipping or a voucher.
There's some other strange things on there, right? You know, you're overfitting on these individual customer names.
Yeah.
Right? So, you know, in your training data, I guess Valerie was very unhappy, and so when you see another Valerie coming along, the model saying, whatever you do, don't call her by her name, right?
Well, that's the other thing is, so that's a great point. Not many people pick up on that, so points to you. The first thing that they message to customers to try to personalize the interaction is, hi, my name is Kelly. I'm going to be your customer service representative today. So these are things we have fixed since we generated this, but what the algorithm was picking up on is Kelly's not very good or at least not as good as some of the other representatives at handling inquiries, right? So what the algorithm is saying is, don't ever say your name is Kelly, right? Just say your name. That's not what's going on, right? We need to train Kelly. Maybe there's some opportunity for improvement there, but it's not the word Kelly that's yielding a bad interaction. Right, so great point, which exactly motivates the next point. Oh man, the formatting on this got a little messed up. But it's not just about, it's about building these algorithms. Remember, we saw this closed loop diagram, building the classifiers, then issuing recommendations and feedback to the agent. And then, this is the key, we monitor their user behavior. We A/B test the recommendations. In some cases, we say apologize. In some cases, we say, you know what, you should offer a voucher or give them something for free. And not only that, but the agent is the mediator here. We don't have direct interaction with the customer. If the agent decides, F this, I'm not following any of the recommendations, our analytics are worthless. So we need to do behavioral modification. This is behavioral economics. How can I display this message in a way that gets across to this person? Is it where I position it? Is it adding colors? Do some people respond better to, hey, I think you should do this, as opposed to, hey, this conversation is going really poorly, try this. Right, so we're constantly A/B testing all of these things because that agent is, we need to understand that agent as well as the customer, if not better than the customer. And ultimately, when we A/B test different approaches and we see how the visitor reacts, we predict what they would have done, we thought, then we see how they actually do react, and then we do enough of that we get a pattern that we observe in the data. That's when we're able to learn causally what is driving good and bad outcomes. That feeds back into the system, and ultimately, those recommendations that we'll be pushing out to machines that were mediated by humans, we're going to be issuing decision trees, scoring with decision trees. Should you go down this path or that path with a customer? Should you be, let's give us a sample of responses. We'll choose one. I'll be done in a sec. And can I autocorrect your bot-driven responses? Can I take the bot responses and can I give them a little bit of a tweak or a boost? When you take the human out of the loop, this is the result. Last slide. I love this interaction on the left. Thank you for sending Indigo. It's an airline in Southeast Asia. Thank you for sending my baggage to Hyderabad and flying me to Calcutta at the same time. Brilliant service. What does the bot say? Glad to hear it. Keep flying. Response, are you serious? Like, it's a bad interaction, right? When you let the bot loose, and eventually we'll get to the point where it can pick up on those sort of sarcastic comments. And then, of course, I always, it's a little bit of a nudge to Microsoft, but everyone knows about Tay, right? That the bot that they had released out in the wild, they were very excited about this, and basically people found ways to make Tay say things that were anti-Semitic and homophobic and things like that. This is what we want to be careful of. Obviously, these are cautionary tales. We want to avoid that. And the way you do that is by having the machines and human beings work together, teaching humans how to interact better, having the machines close the loop and teach the machines how to interact better, and then ultimately we can build a truly bot-enabled world. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. So, on Tay, what went wrong there? Were they using reinforcement learning, and the reinforcer was sort of, how much feedback and commentary they got from other tweeters, or what was the?
So there's definitely, it was deep learning and neural nets that, is generating responses contextually based on what it thought was appropriate. The trick, what caused this was that this was actually less of a data science piece and more of a just, an oops. They built functionality that would allow people to get Tay to repeat. If you said, Tay, repeat after me, it would echo whatever it heard. And so as a result, people immediately, as soon as people realized this, they were like, I can make this thing say whatever I want. This is brilliant. And that was what caused this. So there's a small glitch, less an issue with the neural nets, but they realized this is a hard lesson for Microsoft to learn, which is we need some guardrails here. We're not just going to let this thing out into the world and allow it to do whatever it is that people tell it to do.
Yeah, it's kind of like when the Alexa ordered all those dollhouses on.
Oh, I didn't know this one.
So what happened was, this girl said, "Boy, I really would love to have a dollhouse. You know, Alexa, I want a dollhouse." And so this like $1,000 dollhouse arrived at the house, and so the TV reporters, they brought her on and interviewed her, and they said, "So, like, what did you say?" And she said, "Alexa, buy me a dollhouse." And everyone who was watching TV at that moment that had Alexas got dollhouses. Alexa heard it on TV. So thousands of dollhouses showed up at people's houses. And so they had to, so now Alexa is trying to train on the specific voice of the people that live in the house. So anybody on TV can't just order millions of things.
That's brilliant. I'm gonna add that to the slide. That'll be the next bot. Look up bot fails. It's amazing. It's hilarious. Just hours of entertainment.
Okay, great.